Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the universe, about books, movies, music that I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today we are talking about this book, Spinal Catastrophism, A Secret History, by Thomas Moynihan. This book was recommended to me on an earlier video. I did a couple of videos about disturbing books, and this book was one of two recommendations from a YouTube user whose @ is Nolly Druge. I guess that's how you pronounce it. It's on the screen. I'd like to thank you, if you're watching, for recommending this book. Very interesting, very unusual, super strange. I think it's going to be interesting to talk about it. So I have no context other than the recommendation for this book. I don't know who Thomas Moynihan is. I don't know how other people situate or understand this book. I didn't read anything about it on the internet, so I don't know if the things I'm going to say about it are correct. This is just my understanding or opinion or perspective on this book. It was published in 2019 originally. There's a revised edition in 2020, and this is a reprint of the revised edition from last year, 2024. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say what I think this book is right at the beginning, then I'm going to go through the contents of the book, and then I'm going to give my opinions about it right at the end. So I see this book as being in quite an unusual genre that I have encountered before, but not very often. It's like a type of philosophy book or a history of ideas, a kind of theory book, where the language might remind you of somebody like Mark Fisher or Eugene Thacker. But instead of being kind of straight theory, it's kind of an attempt at existential horror, cosmic horror, with aspects of science fiction mixed in or written in the style of philosophy. And the question right at the beginning is, when you're reading it, is always, does Thomas Moynihan believe the arguments that he's presenting? Or is this kind of a creative, artistic strategy? And he doesn't ever really give enough clues for you to decide. And in that way, it reminds me of somebody like William Burroughs. Although Burroughs mostly wrote fiction, he had a lot of kind of ideas and theories about the universe and the world, kind of weird metaphysics. Like an example is that William Burroughs thought that the universe was pre-recorded, and he created artistic strategies to kind of remix or break the recording. And my question has always been, did Burroughs really believe this, or was it an artistic strategy? But at a certain point, when everything you do is an expression of your artistic strategy, the question of belief kind of becomes moot. And this is kind of what this book is like for me. It's like whether or not it's an exercise or whether it's an expression of like a genuine philosophical perspective. At a certain point, when it's so detailed and so well executed, it's like you just have to go along for the ride, and the question of whether he really believes it or not kind of becomes an irrelevance. So Burroughs had this idea that the universe was pre-recorded, and Burroughs is mentioned in this book, which is why I am referencing him. What's the basic proposition of this book? It's essentially that the development of the human and the human being, the entire history of evolutionary development from the absolute earliest stages of life, are all still present within the human being and the human body. Past iterations of human and pre-human life are observable in the central nervous system, and especially in the spine. The spine, therefore, is presented in this book as a kind of physical history of trauma, or the trauma of evolutionary and cosmic development. And the book itself is dedicated to Thomas Moynihan's scoliosis. So it's kind of implied that it's written by a person who experiences a lot of back pain, and that maybe it's an expression of, or that it grows out of this person's own relationship to their physical form. So it starts with a preface, which is called A Plutarchian Coda. I don't know what that means, and I don't understand anything else in the preface. It's written by somebody called Ian Hamilton Grant. I think I think it's like it's a genuinely coherent argument. It's a few pages, but the language and references are so um, oblique and opaque and arcane that I had no way of understanding it. And at this point, I thought, is this book going to be readable? Because I had to skip the last couple of pages of this preface. And then when you get into the main body of the book, written by Thomas Moynihan, it is written in very kind of academic, quite arcane language, but compared to the preface, it's far more readable. So it's almost like that preface is there to give you a sense of relief when you start reading the rest of the book. I'm going to try to summarize part one of the book. This is called the Cervical Prospectus, and it kind of lays the groundwork for the rest of the book, talking about the importance of the spine in human thinking, human life, and in our understanding of the human being. It starts off with something that I find really interesting. Moynihan talks about Kant's idea of the cervical zenith. Now, I've never heard of this before, but basically the argument is that the development of upright walking in the human, because most other animals walk horizontally with their front and back limbs kind of both on the ground, and that they're sort of like a horizontal stomach type creature with a mouth and a stomach and an anus, but the human being walks upright. And the argument is that this orientation on the planet is the basis or the origins of also of all of the other ways we orient ourselves. So the fact that we have feet on the ground and head up towards the sky is also how we understand up and down, forwards, backwards, left and right. So there's the argument that this physical development is also the origins of how we begin to colonize or dominate the planet that we live on. Two related arguments are that this kind of cognitive growing outwards and broader orientation is doubled with a kind of inner complexity, that our ability to orient ourselves in our environment also leads to a kind of collapsing inwards, that we have more and more detailed, complex inner lives. If you think about it like this, that all of our experience of the outer world is actually inner experience. All of the complexity of the outer world is really just our own inner representation of it. The human being in itself is a kind of set of complex cognitive and somatic representations and experiences which sort of structure an outside world that comes to us only through the nervous system. In this sense, and in the sense that we kind of understand the world also through our movement through it and the movements of our bodies, our nervous system also is the origin of the concept of time, which he calls chronogenesis, and the concept of the future, because at a certain point when we orient ourselves in the world, we start to project kind of possible cause and effect and possible future phenomena or events, and at that point we kind of create the future, is the argument. Did you follow me so far? Another thing that's interesting in this set of arguments is the idea that the human being, if you follow it far enough back evolutionarily, is connected to or developed from forms that were sort of circular and symmetrical, that today we think of as, you can think of an amoeba, or you can think of like a jellyfish, you can think of these like proto-life forms that were in the ocean. They didn't have a front or a back or a left or a right. Their nervous system and their sensory apparatus was circular. So there's this idea that we moved from what Moynihan calls radial symmetry, circularity, to bilateral symmetry, left and right, forward and back. And that this, at the same time, was connected to cephalization, the development of bone. The development of bone is linked to the violence of the world, the trauma on the ocean bed, and also this development of bilateral symmetry and the physical form is connected to, in the text, the origins of pain. I'm just going to read a little quote that's describing this development, and it will give you a sense of the language in the book. This onset of faciality cranially lifts the postchordate heterotroph out of panoptical immersion. Brackets, that is to say, this circular way of experiencing the world from all angles, reinforcing a directional aperture onto the world via filtration of peripheral fields. Yet with potentiation comes pain. So this is part of the argument that the book is based upon, that these physical developments are the origins both of cognition and of suffering. And that the development of the skeleton is evidence of the terrible dangers of the environment within which the human being developed. So if you're with me so far, you might be saying, Vincent, what are you talking about? This is just philosophy. It's just history of ideas, philosophy. It's questions about what is the human, what is thought. And I agree. It's this first part one, really fascinating, really interesting, and really makes you think about, human development and what it is to be in the world and what it is to be a human. But then we get to part 2, and then there's a shift. And this is where the concept of spinal catastrophism is really introduced. So all of this part 1 is a setup for the importance of the central nervous system and the spine. And then we jump to the year 2000, and Moynihan introduces the person he says is the originator of the concept of spinal catastrophism. This is a thinker and scientist named Daniel Charles Barker, born in 1952, still living, but nobody knows where he is. He was a professor of anorganic semiotics at MVU from the early 90s up until the millennium, and then he disappeared. The story goes that he originally worked at NASA, and he was recruited in the 80s to work on messaging extraterrestrials and trying to find and decode messages from space. So this is some kind of like advanced, top secret research stuff on extraterrestrial intelligence. Barker realized at a certain point that the major difference between naturally occurring phenomena in the universe and intelligently originating interstellar activity was that things of intelligence, things that originated with an alien intelligence, could be camouflaged, that the intelligence could make the decision to camouflage itself. And based on this idea, he came to the conclusion that it wasn't feasible to search for current intelligence, but that what we could find in the universe were relics of ancient civilizations. And I don't know if he developed or he joined a species of thought called astropaleontology, which is the search for the relics of ancient civilizations. From here comes the idea that life on Earth is precisely such a relic, that life on Earth might be seeded by alien intelligence, that the origins of life on this planet is a relic of an ancient civilization. And this is an idea that I've seen in science fiction. You see it to an extent in 2001. You definitely see it in the later Alien films by Ridley Scott, like Prometheus. And one of the arguments that Barker developed was that the human genome could be a kind of encrypted informational set of messages or encoded impulses. And it's stated in the book that the human genome is like 98% non-coding, but that Barker's idea was that that's just because the environment or the situation that 98% is supposed to respond to has not occurred yet, and that actually redundancy is just a feature of being too early, so that the human being is really just a carrier for some other phenomenon, being, occurrence that we haven't arrived at yet. So this part of the chapter is this kind of argument for some kind of intelligent design where human beings are really kind of sentient carriers for an ancient alien project. But then it goes on to some other ideas like the Fermi paradox, which is that when civilizations progress to a certain point technologically where they can begin to intervene in the basics of physics, like space, time, dimensions, an alien civilization reaches a point where it becomes indistinguishable from the conditions of the universe. And then there's an argument that, for example, that we are already living inside an alien consciousness, that the cosmos or the universe is an alien consciousness. This overlaps a little bit with some of the ideas in the science fiction book that I discussed recently, Death's End by Cixin Liu. It's difficult for me to kind of tie all of these ideas together in the way that Moynihan does. He does it very eloquently, and I think that his very sophisticated language sometimes kind of hides the fact that they're not all directly coherent. But it gets to the point where there's an argument that the human body and the human nervous system and the spine is not only a record of life on Earth, but is in fact a record of the development of the universe. So, this idea that life on Earth is seeded by an alien intelligence, or that we already exist within the development of cosmic intelligence, then we can begin to read the human nervous system as a kind of history of cosmic or universal development. And this comes then to Barker's concept of spinal catastrophism, which I'm just going to read the definition from the book. Erect posture and perpendicularization of the skull is a frozen calamity associated with a long list of pathological consequences, among which should be included most of the human psychoneuroses. So this is to say that, like, all of our psychological issues, our psychiatric problems, our tics, our psychosomatic disorders are all the consequences of archaic cosmic traumas, disasters, and terrifying events. And so in this idea, our kind of daily mundane psychological issues are lifted up to the level of all existence. Okay, now this is a good time to say that I think, and I don't know because I've done no checking, but I think this chapter is a hoax. I don't think Barker is a real person. The way that the story is described, with him working for NASA and then he becomes some kind of university lecturer and his work is like suppressed and then he goes missing, it all sounds like it's partly based on kind of characters from J.G. Ballard novels, and maybe influenced by also the story of Nick Land, who was an English theory writer whose work kind of began to overlap with science fiction at a certain point, and who was also using a lot of amphetamine. He had a psychotic break and he went missing for years. He actually turned up a few years before this book was published in China and started writing kind of quite reactionary fascist material. But the first part of his career is kind of very influential on, for example, Mark Fisher. If I can find it, I'm going to put an article about Nick Land in the description of this video, because I really do think that he's an inspiration for this character of Barker. I might be wrong, maybe Barker's real, but honestly, I don't think so. I think that this is kind of a sort of weird fiction short story that is inserted into a history of ideas, and that the ideas are kind of built around it. So I think this book is a kind of extremely weird novel. Right, so what the rest of this book does is that it follows the supposed antecedents of spinal catastrophism, the ideas going back through J.G. Ballard, through William Burroughs, through Wilhelm Reich, back to the Romantics like Coleridge and Schelling. And the book is actually structured around an idea from The Crystal World by J.G. Ballard about how the spine kind of, if you go, the further back down the spine you go, the further you can trace the development of the human animal. The idea being that you can descend through the central nervous system to the pre-human past. And the book is actually structured, the chapters are structured around the bones within the spine. The argument is that the point where the spine goes to the lumbar section of the lower spine is a zone of transit between gill-breathing fish and air-breathing amphibians, and then up beyond that, you become to see like primate development, and then at the top, in the skull and the brain, is where you have the greater apes and the human. So I'm not going to get into all of the ideas in these sections because, for the first thing, it's too complex. For another thing, if you want to read the book, I don't want to take away the enjoyment of like all of the bizarre and crazy kind of syntheses of different writers and different thought that this book kind of presents to you. It's like this dizzying, overpowering idea of a kind of like secret history of thought, like a kind of hidden truth of the human animal. But it touches on ideas around the death drive from psychoanalysis, and this idea that all living matter yearns to return to like a non-living form. And there's a version of that that's taken from J.G. Ballard, that we yearn to return from our kind of non-symmetrical, directional way of seeing the world to this kind of circular, symmetrical roundness, this pre-skeletal form of existence, as if we all really deeply yearn to become like a jellyfish or a starfish. There's also an argument that's kind of an interesting sort of crossover between science fiction and philosophy, that the human nervous system continually externalizes itself, so that first kind of power lines and then telegraph wires and then the internet is just a kind of extension of the human nervous system out across the planet and ultimately beyond. And then he develops the idea towards the end of the book that human intelligence, in doing this, removes the need for its own existence. Like that intelligence grows out of a need to protect the organism, but that ultimately it leads to a state of kind of decadent safety where it's no longer necessary. And you can almost like read our current cultural situation in the Western world, where we just sit and scroll on mobiles all day, as like the triumph of intelligence in its attempt to make itself obsolescent. Then right at the end of the book, Moynihan starts to present ideas that we today recognize as being antinatalist. Like he starts with Schopenhauer, who argues that the nervous system, as we discussed right at the beginning of the video in reference to Kant, that the nervous system structures and therefore kind of creates reality, that awareness causes suffering, that there's a certain kind of moral imperative to extinguish or abolish awareness, because then you have a world without suffering. And so Schopenhauer's suggestion was that we should stop reproducing in order to remove suffering from existence. Schopenhauer, kind of an incel. He then presents Edgar Saltus, who's argued that the principle of existence itself is the issue, not suffering necessarily, but existence. And he presents a Russian writer called Vladimir Odevsky, who I've never heard of. And this writer wrote a short story about a kind of group of humans who could see that human history is a kind of history of suffering, whose task it was to kind of remove all awareness from the galaxy or from the universe or from existence, to kind of nullify suffering. And then right at the end, he returns to this character of Barker, and he describes how Barker kind of did a sort of he describes how Barker did a kind of research on the universe by turning inward, and how he could hear that his own tinnitus was the sound of the Big Bang. So this sense that like all time is always with us, and that kind of a genuine and deep exposure to the intrinsic trauma of the universe leads to madness, basically. Okay, so now we got to my thoughts about the book. So first of all, I want to say that the start of this book is one of the most interesting, exciting, intellectually stimulating things I've read for a long time. It's really unique. It's very impressive. I love the introduction of Barker, and I love this kind of way that the book starts with a very rigorous kind of argument about cognition and the body, and then lifts it into this kind of weird fiction territory about like, you know, whether or not the human skull is like shaped after a planet. Like it's so kind of wide ranging and weird and and imaginative and exciting. There's something fascinating about the paradox of a book like this, where extreme creativity is used to argue against creation and to present these kind of very nihilistic, anti life ideas. I found the turn towards antinatalism and this kind of abolish all consciousness kind of argument towards the end to be really disappointing. You might recognize this as being kind of similar to Thomas Ligotti's book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. If you are a fan of Ligotti, you'll know that some of these arguments about like consciousness being kind of the origins of all suffering and therefore being a negative thing can be found in this book. But it actually reminded me most of a more obscure book called Every Cradle is a Grave by Sarah Perry, where she attempts to kind of discuss antinatalism, you know, which is the philosophy that humans should not reproduce, and ultimately extend it to the idea that humans have a responsibility to abolish all consciousness wherever it exists in the universe. My issue with all of this is that it's basically, the argument goes like this: suffering is bad, ergo awareness is bad, because suffering has its origin in awareness. Ergo, there is a moral imperative to destroy all life and awareness. I just think it's really bad logic. I also think it's based on like very cherry-picked ideas. Like, for example, Wilhelm Reich is referenced and used quite a lot in this book. Wilhelm Reich has this idea about the central nervous system being connected to like prehistoric forms, that that all life is kind of an expression of two modes, expanding in exploration and contracting in anxiety, and that all life is a pulsation between these 2 points. What you could say in this book is that this is an expression of a very contracted position that's focused entirely on pain and suffering and not on expansion, exploration. At least in its argumentation, this is what I'm saying about the paradox, is it's such an expansive book intellectually. Another thing is that if you were actually going to include Reich's ideas, Reich believes that all matter, it doesn't really believe in a difference between organic and non-organic matter. He believed that life developed from incandescent burning material at the earth, like, you know, in the Earth's core, for example. He believed that life is continually being generated from non-living materials. So the idea of being able to destroy all life and all consciousness is just totally anathema to that perspective. Likewise, reminds me of, I don't claim to be a Nietzsche scholar, but Nietzsche is referenced here, and this book kind of reminds me of Nietzsche's criticism in Thus Spake Zarathustra about perspectives on the world like Christianity and Buddhism that reject what is, that cannot tolerate the facts or the basic immanence of life, that despise the body. And this book is very much a kind of expression of body horror. For me, the absolute best part of this book is the story about Barker, this thinker who is driven mad by seeing the universe for what it truly is and the human form for what it truly is. There's something Lovecraftian about this. There's something kind of very in the tradition of weird fiction where somebody, the kind of veil is lifted and the person cannot tolerate the reality of reality. I love this, and the ideas that he had about like alien consciousness and, you know, humans as a programmed kind of deliverer of some kind of alien information. I found all that more frightening and more disturbing than this kind of like barren, antinatalist, anti-life perspective that comes up towards the end. That to me is more conventional. It's less interesting. I thought that the ideas that Barker was presenting in the text were like super exciting and disturbing, and I wish that more of that had come back at the end. But it's kind of strange to criticize a book like this for what it didn't do, because it's such a unique and bizarre text in the first place. So I would still recommend it very much to anybody who thought that my description of it sounded even vaguely interesting. I don't think you've probably ever read a book like it. So I'd like to say thank you again for the recommendation. I hope that you've enjoyed my discussion of this book, and I'm always open to recommendations for strange, unusual, weird, or disturbing texts. I really get a lot out of reading things that I can't quite get a handle on immediately, or that are difficult to place, or that are playing with ideas in the way that this book does. That's everything from me for now. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. To the extent that you have, like the video, subscribe, drop me a comment, all that stuff. Okay, thanks very much. Much love. Take care.